Good evening and welcome to the Arundel Camera Club live stream for Wednesday, April 14th, 2021. My name is John Milliker and I'm the club president for the 2020-2021 season. The Arundel Camera Club was founded in 1957 and exists to promote the art, science, and education in all aspects and fields of photography. Normally we meet at 7 p.m. every Wednesday evening during the school year in Severna Park, Maryland. However, with the current disruptions, we've decided to continue business as normal in a virtual space, which allows us to protect our members and guests from the current COVID-19 situation. For more information about us, please visit www.arundelcameraclub.org. I want to remind everybody that on Wednesday, May 5th, we're holding our business meeting, and everyone on the mailing list has received a link to a questionnaire. Please be sure to take your time to fill it out, and if you didn't receive the link in your email, please contact one of our club officers for that link. The meeting will be hosted only on our conference server, and we hope you'll join us. Remember, this is how you help shape the club for the upcoming year. I've also received last call from our nominations committee for club officer positions. If you or someone you know would make a great addition to the club officers team, please be sure to reach out to Kathy Hockel as she and the nomination team is wrapping up their great work for the business meeting. And here's our program's chair, Christine Milliker, to finish the rest of the schedule.
On Wednesday, April 21st is our digital photo contest with a theme of One Light Portraits. Keep an eye out for an email from Lewis for entry guidelines and the deadline. Also, make sure to mark your calendars for our next meet and shoot, which is now our April field trip, and it will be at the Fort Smallwood Park on Saturday, April 24th, with a rain date of Sunday, April 25th. Times are 11 to 3, and there is a $6 per vehicle entry payable by cash or check at the gate. As always, bring your chair, lunch, and a camera. We'll have great views of the bay, the Key Bridge, Battery Hartshorn, and the local birding pond. Invite your friends, family, and anyone interested in photography. See our post to Facebook and our email we sent out for more information. Please bring a pre-made lunch as there is no opportunity to cook in the park. On April 28th, we have our very own Bob Weber giving a presentation on hidden colors, where he will be talking about experimental exploration of the color curve tool. On May 5th is our yearly business meeting, and as John said, it's important to attend and to be a part of our decision-making, themes for next year, and the future of our club. If you would like to test your browser and microphone, there will be a practice session on the evening of Sunday, May 2nd. Our April photo assignment is going to be spring. We have a survey out discussing how and when we will discuss this assignment. Now on to tonight's presentation. Tonight we have Lewis Katz joining us to discuss From Capture to Print, the art of black and white photography. Lewis has had a camera in his hand from the age of 14. Inspired by his father, he began to explore photography more seriously in high school with a darkroom in the basement. Fast forward a few years to his life in Baltimore and his joining the Baltimore Camera Club. Further inspired by his peers, Lewis became an award-winning photographer and photography teacher. He currently teaches at Johns Hopkins University, the Community College of Baltimore County, Capitol Photography Center out of D.C., as well as the Baltimore Camera Club. He lives for the aha moments which only teaching can provide. Good evening, Lewis. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Christine. Thank you very much for that kind introduction.
You're very welcome.
And good evening, everyone out there. And thank you for attending this meeting. And as the title indicates, we're going to spend the next maybe 75, 80 minutes or so discussing black and white photography. And I will share my screen in a second. I'll just fill in a few other little things about my bio and myself, which might be relevant to the program that I'm about to present. As many of us had, a lot of us had an adult in our lives that was influential on our photography. And as Christine said, in my case, my dad was the family slide photographer. All of our family trips were shot on slide, Ektachrome or Kodachrome. And a few times a year, we were all sat down, my brother and I and my mom, and we broke out the Kodak carousel and put up the screen and took a look at our slides. And that always really captivated me. And I was lucky enough to go to a high school in New York City where I grew up that actually did offer some photography classes as electives. And I took a couple of those classes. And that's what inspired me to put a little rudimentary darkroom in my basement. So, of course, What this means is that I started out purely as a black and white photographer, because in terms of developing, I wasn't even attempting to develop any color work. It was purely black and white. Now, when I graduated high school and went to college in Massachusetts, I really didn't pick up my camera for quite a while. Through a very circuitous route, I ended up moving from Massachusetts to the Baltimore area for a job and a career in the travel business. But I didn't end up living in Baltimore proper. I lived 40 minutes north of Baltimore in a very rural area of southern York County, Pennsylvania, which is right over the border from Maryland. And I had never lived in a rural area before. And I was immediately captivated by the farms and the rolling hills and the barns and the animals. And it was, for a New York kid, it was a totally different kind of experience. And that's what led me to pick up a camera again. And I was still shooting slides at that point on my Olympus OM, I guess my 2N. So for years, I was basically a color slide, travel and landscape and nature photographer. That's what I shot. And it wasn't until I became involved with the Baltimore Camera Club that I became more exposed to black and white photography. I moved to Baltimore proper in 2001, and I now live, in the city of Baltimore. And a lot of my peers were very influential on my growth and my liking of black and white photography. And what we're going to discuss tonight is, after I spent more time studying and thinking and delving into what about it is so attractive to me, that's really what the thrust of the program is tonight. So I'm going to just share my screen now. So everyone should now be able to see my Lightroom screen. The program is going to be basically shown out of Lightroom, and we'll be doing some black and white conversions in Lightroom as well. So the name of the program is From Capture to Print, the Art of Black and White Photography. There is my website address is just my name, lewiskatzphotography.com. And there's my email address, olympus21209@yahoo.com. Olympus is a brand of camera that I've been very loyal to for almost 50 years. I still shoot an Olympus mirrorless camera, but about a year ago, I added a Nikon DSLR to my bag as well, but I didn't want to change my email address. So it is still Olympus and my zip code, and then just at yahoo.com. Ansel Adams. We all know Ansel as one of the masters of black and white photography, and he has a series of wonderful quotes, but this is by far my favorite quote, and it really is a perfect introduction to this program. A great photograph is one that truly expresses what one feels in the deepest sense about what is being photographed. You will notice that quite a lot of my program tonight is going to deal with emotions and photography, because what I decided after delving into this in much more detail and putting this program together is that it's the emotive quality that black and white has that really attracted me to become more of a black and white photographer than I ever was before, except when I was like 14 and 15 years old. I still shoot color. There are definitely some things that I think work well in color, but black and white to me is far more expressive and emotive, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. What we're going to start with is going through some photographs and some photographers of people that also had an influence on me, and they are mostly the iconic photographers that a lot of you will know. So, of course, after an Ansel quote, it's always a good idea to show an Ansel Adams image, and this is certainly one of his most iconic images of the Snake River and the Tetons. And I think why we are so attracted to Ansel is not only his technical prowess, which is quite amazing, both shooting as well as printing, but I think with some of his more iconic images, you really can feel the connection that Ansel had with the environment. And I think that feeling of connection, and he was a very ardent environmentalist as well, that feeling is what makes his images so wonderful, because you can actually sense the connection that he has or had with the landscapes that he shot. And that's why I think he remains today one of the most, iconic and well-known and well-valued black and white photographers, because his images are now going for some astronomical figures. So here's an image by a woman by the name of Vivian Mayer, and that name may mean something to most of you or some of you. Vivian Mayer was a nanny by profession in New York and Chicago, but she actually was an amazing street photographer who never shared her work with anyone. And her work wasn't even discovered until after she passed away, and her negatives were auctioned off to two gentlemen that then discovered how wonderful Vivian Mayer was as a photographer. I'm imagining that she's walking behind, this might be one of the families that she was nannying for. And what I think this image shows is one of these qualities of black and white that is so attractive to me. Black and white is, in its essence, and this is what I was taught originally by the speakers that came through the Baltimore Camera Club, the standard line was always color is a distraction. And when you remove color, you're left with the basic bones of the image: shapes, patterns, tonality, line, and repetition, all of those things that we do associate with black and white photography. And I definitely, all of those qualities resonate with me. But there's a lot more to it that I then discovered in terms of getting into it a little more. And I think one of the most effective uses of black and white is to have a beautiful graphic context. So in this case, we have that beautiful stone wall, which is a beautiful line to infinity. We have the repetitive benches. We have a figure in the distance. We have the trees being picked up, the shadows of the trees being picked up by the puddle. But it's the three figures, it's the human element in this picture and in many pictures that I think give black and white its power, because it's the human element, and in some cases the animal element that adds a vulnerability to a lot of really great black and white work. And I think that's why a lot of us really resonate with black and white, because of that vulnerability. And this image, I just love it, with the dad and the two young kids on roller skates. And you can see the daughter turning around and probably looking, at Vivian while she's, creating this wonderful shot. And here we have Henri Cartier-Bresson, another beautiful, wonderful black and white photographer. And again, we have a wonderful atmospheric graphic representation. This scene without the people and without the cat would still be quite a wonderful image. You have the beautiful stairway going off to the left. You have the implied stairway to the right, because you kind of know that gentleman isn't stepping off the face of the earth when he gets to the end of the sidewalk. But you have the wet sidewalk, and I think the addition not only of the two figures, I think the most important element in this photograph is actually the cat, which adds a tremendous amount of mystery and atmosphere to the image. And I think mystery is another great quality of black and white photography that I find much more expressive in black and white than in color. And here we have an image by another iconic photographer, Margaret Bourke White, who worked for quite a few publications and then actually became a war correspondent. And here she is shooting down into a silk mill or a silk factory from above. And this image has all of the wonderful attributes of a black and white image: repetition, tonality of whites to darks, the patterns, the lines, the texture. But again, to me, it's the placement of the people that are operating these machines that give this image its vulnerability and its humanity. Because at the time when this image was taken, you can imagine that these people probably spent anywhere between 8 and 12 hours a day on their feet, working these huge silk looms. So I think, again, it's the addition of the human element which makes this such a powerful photograph. And here we have an image by a gentleman named Thomas Farkas. And again, the image without the dancer is still going to be a very nice image with the beautiful light coming through the doors, the patterns being formed on in the rectangular windows, and the pattern on the floor. But by far, it's the curvature of the dancer and the long shadow that the dancer is throwing onto the pattern floor that gives this image its humanity, its atmosphere, and its vulnerability. And again, these are all images that had a very big influence on me as I was beginning to shoot more black and white photography. Here we have a wonderful image by Dorothea Lange, another one of my favorite photographers, and again, mostly shot black and white. And we have a solo girl back to the wall. The light is coming in from a window behind where the girl is sitting, and she's just sitting staring at this empty fireplace. And you're just left to wonder, what is she thinking? Is she thinking, are we going to have any wood for a fire tonight? Maybe she's thinking, are we going to have anything to eat today? And, whatever colors the room is actually made up of would be totally distracting from what Dorothea wants you to look at. She wants you to look at the young girl. She wants you to look at the shadow of her face being in shadow. So it's hard to see the details. I mean, she wants you to begin to feel that loneliness and that abandonment potentially that I think only black and white can really convey. I tend to associate black and white with probably more of what I would consider the negative emotions, loneliness, vulnerability, passion, which can be negative or positive. And I usually associate my color photography with more positive emotions like joy. That doesn't mean that they both don't bleed over into each other, but that's how I sort of interpreted why I liked black and white so much. So this is one of my favorite images by a gentleman named Thomas Freed. And again, it's got a beautiful backdrop. The architectural backdrop is amazing, right? The repetitive shapes of the sconces, repetitive shapes of the windows and the doors, the beautiful light coming down this street. But by far, it is these two cats that make this image sing. The cat approaching from the distance has his or her tail up and very open type of body language. I've been a cat person for a long time, so you get to know cat body language. And the cat in the foreground is very tense and very alert. And what makes this image so wonderful is that you just know in the next second or two, something is going to happen between these two cats, but you're really not quite sure what that's going to be. And that's where we also bring in the emotion of suspense, which I think is also very good in black and white. And just think about all the wonderful film directors that shot in black and white, like Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles and think of the movies that they created in black and white and how suspenseful they were. And I feel even in those cases, it was actually the use of black and white in a lot of cases that lent to those movies' power. Here we have another image by Bresson. And again, it's a beautiful capture of a moment in time, which of course he was always known for, that decisive moment. And again, you're left to wonder about this gentleman. He's sitting on the curb at the end of this alleyway, and you get that feeling of loneliness again and abandonment. But again, the addition of the cat adds an element to this image which really is just undeniable. Does the person and a cat have any relation to each other? Did they just find each other on the street? You're left to wonder. And the image has a beautiful graphic context, which Bresson was always good at, these long, narrow alleyways with the details in the brick and in the buildings beyond. But again, it's the cat and the gentleman sitting down that really make this image come alive. This is an image by Elliot Erwitt, a great street photographer. And he wasn't really known to pose his pictures very much. He was very much like a Winogrand kind of style photographer. So I just imagine that he came across this wonderful scene of this young boy in a car, and it looks like a bullet hole or some other projectile that struck the window is just perfectly matching up with one of his eyes. And it just creates this wonderful, powerful, emotional image. And you're so captivated by his face and the eye that you sometimes miss the hand, which is coming out on the other side, on the right-hand side of the frame, which I think is another really important part of this image. You can make out 4 of his 5 fingers that are holding on to the frame of the car. Here we have an image by Robert Frank, very well known for his book called The Americans, which, by the way, if you can find a copy these days in good shape, used, because it's out of print, you should grab it because it's very hard to find these days. And this is a wonderful image by Robert Frank with all of these people framed perfectly by the window frames. And what it's wonderful showing is the diversity of America, not only in the age differences between these people, but the ethnic differences between these people, the expression differences between the people. And again, whatever color this streetcar or bus is, and I'm going to imagine it was probably like a deep red or a deep green, would just draw your attention away from what Robert Frank wants you to look at. He wants you to look at the people. That's what his whole purpose was in creating this book called The Americans. This is a wonderful image by a Chinese photographer named Fan Ho. And getting a good vantage point is always great for great photography. So he is definitely up on a balcony of some sort, shooting down, and either some building or some fence is creating this wonderful graphic representation with these very strong shadow lines. And notice that he caught this at the perfect moment. There's a person within each of these column shadows, each going in their own direction, each having something completely different on their mind. And it just makes for a wonderful composition and a wonderful image. And again, the color of the pavement, whatever it might be, it certainly wouldn't add anything to the emotional impact that an image like this has. It's just the graphic representation combined with the human element, which is, again, what I think makes some black and white photography really just rise above other images. Now, another part of this putting together this program that was fun is finding some photographers that I wasn't familiar with whose black and white work I really loved. This is by someone by the name of Bahadir Burnek. Now, I think a lot of us have been to carnivals and amusement parks and have taken images like this of people on rides. but this was one of the best ones that I've ever seen, because we are talking about black and white. And I think we as photographers sometimes get a little afraid of using pure blacks and pure whites to help us translate what we're trying to translate to our viewers. And what I love about this image is that the ride itself is just a black monolith, on the right-hand side of the image. And then, of course, it works its way out to the center of the image. And the people themselves are dark. You don't see any details of the people except for some of the young girls. Their hair is flying out to the side. And that's what, again, adds to the suspense and to the mystery of an image like this. And Hitchcock has a movie called Strangers on a Train, which actually ends in an amusement park. And if you watch the last 15 minutes of that movie, you can take that movie apart, still image by still image, and every single camera angle was handpicked by Hitchcock to express that suspense and that mystery. This is another wonderful graphic image. I think it's also by the same photographer. So even without the person sitting on the stairs, I would love this image. I love industrial type images, and this is a wonderful black and white image. But again, it's the addition of that person sitting on that stairway. Looks like maybe he is smoking a cigarette. And again, you're just left to wonder, is he waiting for somebody? Is he waiting for an office to open? Is he just taking a rest? You don't really know. So it adds that element of intrigue, to this particular image, which again, I think black and white is very good at. I think a lot of us would admit that we love shooting abandoned places. And why do we love shooting abandoned places? Because they all have a story to tell, and we just don't know what the story is. And so here we have a wonderful image of an abandoned house. It looks to be somewhat of a long exposure because the clouds are moving. What I really appreciated about this one was that not only is the house abandoned and desolate, but the landscape around it is completely abandoned and desolate as well. Except for the house, you only really have those barrels on either side of it that are helping to frame the image. So, of course, you're left to wonder who lived there, under what circumstances did they leave, what's happening, with this house today. And it's one of the things that we love to shoot as photographers. I don't think I'm overgeneralizing when I say that. I think we are all attracted to these abandoned places. This is a wonderful self-portrait by someone that I just know as Elena Kay, and it stopped me dead in my tracks because, again, we are talking black and white, and this is a person, a photographer, who is using the extremes of black and white to create this wonderful atmospheric and powerful self-portrait. The right-hand side of her face is completely dark, and the left-hand side, except for the details of her eye, eyebrow, eyelash, and a little bit of her nose, is completely white. And it's really, to this day, one of the most powerful self-portraits that I've ever seen anyone create. I think another really wonderful quality about black and white is elegance and sophistication. And I think that bleeds into some of the movies that we like to watch. Cary Grant, very suave, sophisticated, especially in some of the older black and white movies. And I think this photographer, who was the same as the first one, Bahadur Burnek, he came across this wonderful scene, which was wet pavement. And I think he just waited for something to happen. And we as photographers at times have to be patient. And he then caught this biker coming through this scene. And I think by combining a slow shutter speed and doing a little panning, he created this wonderfully elegant and sophisticated black and white image. So there are a lot of times when we just as photographers come across a great backdrop, but we just need to be patient and let something happen for us to create a really powerful image. So now let's talk a little more about emotion and black and white, as well as emotion and color. This chart shows what emotions we associate with a variety of different colors, but it also has the emotions that we associate with black, gray, and white. And you can see that if you mix any of the emotive qualities of black, gray, or white together, like mystery from the black and authority from gray and purity from white, and you mix those qualities together, you're going to have quite an interesting photograph. But what's also really important about this chart is that the way we were brought up is that we associate these colors with certain emotions. And so when I said earlier that I wanted to dig deeper into more than just removing color is removing a distraction, to me, color can actually interfere with the message that your image is trying to translate to your viewer. And that's because when we see certain colors, we associate them with certain emotions, and that's just baked into us. The most interesting question I've ever gotten during one of these presentations is whether I thought this color emotion chart would apply in a different culture. And the only way I could answer that, because I was raised in a Western American civilization, is that I think it depends on the culture in which you were brought up in, because it depends how colors are used in a specific culture. You might associate different emotions with some of these colors, but in terms of Western civilization and America in particular, I think we all can really resonate with what these colors associate with in emotions. And I thought this was an extremely helpful chart for me to begin my further understanding of why black and white is so powerful. So now we're going to start looking at some of my work, and I'm going to first show you the color version and talk about it for a little bit, and then I'll show you the what it converted into. So again, emotion to me is very powerful. And every time you fire your shutter, you're creating two instant connections. One is actual and one is implied. The actual connection that's established is between you and your subject matter. Remember that Ansel Adams quote, right? A picture reflects what one truly feels about the subject being photographed. The other that's implied is how your viewers are going to react to an image that you've created, right? Because we all want the people that view our images to have a reaction to what we've created. Now, when we go out in the field with ourselves or with some friends on what I call like a ramble, and we just sort of drive around looking for things to shoot, you're kind of lucky if you come across a few images that day that actually are of subject matter that's of emotional importance to you personally. The other way to look at it, though, is that you can bring yourself to certain locations where you're more likely to run into an emotional moment. And for instance, this is the local Amtrak station in Baltimore, Penn Station. I find that train stations, airports, bus stations, places of transit are a little more highly emotionally charged locations. And so you're more likely to potentially run into an emotional moment at one of these locations. So pre-COVID, of course, I used to stop at my local Amtrak station probably about 3 or 4 times a year with that in mind, thinking, well, what am I going to run into today? So on this particular day, I walked into the station, and I usually just take a seat on a bench, across from where there are some other benches. And I came across this young boy just leaning on his suitcase. And again, right away, it gave me that feeling of potential loneliness and maybe a little adventure because he's got a suitcase, so he's on his way somewhere. But the colors are not helping the viewer or myself at all. I want the eye to be purely drawn to the young boy and leaning on his suitcase. So by just doing some cropping, doing some cleaning up of the image, I now have created an image where your eye, I think, is completely drawn to the boy leaning up against his suitcase. I still have the wonderful light streaming in, causing that wonderful reflection on the floor. And the doors to the right are an important part of the image because they either represent the place where someone's going to come through to meet this boy, or that's the doors that he'll walk through to catch the train that he's taking. And where he's going, who knows? And that's what creates sort of the air of mystery. We have some wonderful old libraries in Baltimore. This is the Peabody Library, and it has this great spiral staircase that we love to shoot. And so one day I was there, and what we're always hoping for is someone to come down the stairs. But we all have elevators now. And so it's very rare that I see anyone using this staircase. But I was there one day by myself, and I was just framing up, how I wanted to shoot the spiral staircase. And sure enough, I heard some footsteps all the way on that top level. And I just said, okay, maybe today's my lucky day. Maybe I'll get a person coming down the stairs, and hopefully the person will be close enough to the railing, and maybe we'll even lean over a little bit so I can include this person in the image. And again, the color, though, is way too heavy. That green just was really taking too much energy, out of the picture. And so by just doing a simple black and white conversion, I think your attention is much more drawn to the woman, because to me, this image is an image of confusion and like someone caught in a maelstrom. I think I called this one In the Vortex. I think I had to put this, we have to title our images for competitions, because that's the feeling that it gave me. It was like this person was caught like in this force field, but it just didn't work for me as a color file at all. But it worked much, much better as a black and white. And lucky for me, she did come close to the edge of the railing and did take a quick peek over. And because of the shutter speed I was using, which was probably about 1/60th of a second, it looks like she has a slight amount of motion to her, which I think adds a little atmosphere, to the image. So here I am back at the Amtrak station again, and I come across this gentleman. Is he homeless? Is he maybe one of the cleaning employees that's just taking a rest? I'm really not sure, but I'm very drawn to this kind of image because there's a real feeling about this gentleman. But again, the colors, the tan of the bench, especially that green coming from the background, it really is very distracting, and it's sending mixed messages about what the emotive power of the image is. And so I wanted to keep all the compositional elements in the image, but simply converting it to black and white, I've drawn your eye right to the gentleman, and his reflection actually shows up better as a black and white. You can see his reflection in the bench, and I've kept all of those compositional elements. I love the sconces on the wall. I love the Amtrak and the telephone sign, but it just works so much better as a color file than a black and white file, because I just think it emphasizes that feeling of loneliness and abandonment and mystery as to what the story is, with this gentleman. Now, sometimes, remember I said color I associate more with joy, but that doesn't mean that black and white can't be fun to play with too. This was actually taken at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. I was on my way to some other exhibit, and I walked by and I turned to my left and I saw these two water fountains, right? Because that's what they are. But I didn't see two water fountains. I saw two people. Those shadows to me looked like skirts, and the reflections from the basins looked like some kind of force field that was coming out of those basins. But again, I wanted to emphasize those qualities. And by converting it to black and white, I was able to darken down what I called the skirts, and I was able to brighten up the force field coming out of the basins. And now I've created an abstract image. And I think it is an image of happiness and joy, but it is a very abstract type of image, and black and white is very good for abstract photography because you are mostly concentrating on the shapes and the patterns and the lines. That's what abstract photography is basically all about. And so I feel that this image somewhat lives in the abstract quality, area. And I just, after I converted it and worked on it, I just really loved the way it came out.
Lewis, we have a question over in chat. Mary
Okay.
Lou would like to know, do you mostly use handheld or do you use your tripod?
So I am mostly doing handheld shooting. When I'm doing more landscape work, I still use a tripod. I used to use a tripod more often than I do now. Most of the images that you've seen so far are all handheld images. And I just am sure that I'm using a fast enough shutter speed so that I don't get shake or blur because, you can't hold a camera below a certain speed. So most of these are handheld images.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So another feeling that we're always trying to convey in our photography is the feeling of awe, which I think is a great emotion, and awe is an emotion. And here I am just up in the area where I used to live, up in York County, Pennsylvania, and there's a big thunderstorm coming together. And the cloud formation is just phenomenal. And that's what I really wanted the eye to look at. And the colors underneath the clouds, although they were digitally enhanced a little bit, they really don't add anything to the image because they actually detract, I think, from your view of the cloud formation. And so again, sometimes it's so simple. I just took the color out of the foreground landscape, and I think now the viewer is left with just the feeling of awe from this amazing storm cloud that's brewing up. And this, within 5 minutes of me taking this image, turned into a huge thunderstorm. So I was lucky to be close to my car because this really, it poured really hard for a while. But it's that feeling of awe that we're trying to convey a lot of times. So people ask me, do I think in black and white? Do I shoot in black and white? I'll answer the second question first. You definitely never should shoot in black and white. You should always shoot in color and use a software program to convert to black and white. And that's because although your cameras have the ability to convert to black and white, the algorithms that are built into your cameras, they're not nearly as powerful as the algorithms that are built into the software programs, whether they be Adobe or any other company that does, software programs. So, but I'll answer the first question, do I think in black and white? The answer to that is sometimes I do. And here I am in the Hudson River Valley. And this was the view from our balcony of our Airbnb that we were staying at. And there's this house in the distance. It's obviously not abandoned. It actually is a very nice looking house. And I had this very nice stormy sky beginning to develop. And I loved those power lines that were off to the left, but the colors were not at all working for me. They don't add anything to the image, and emotionally they're actually sending sort of a mixed message. And so then again, after doing a conversion and working on the image some more, I think I've now created a much more powerful, emotive and atmospheric image by basically really darkening down all of the foliage, making sure that you can still see the power lines off to the left, which gives the image a real sense of scale, and by darkening the sky and making the stormy sky look even a little stormier. So this is an example of me looking through my viewfinder and saying, this might be a really good black and white image when I get it back home and work on it. The other great quality about black and white is timelessness. Now, why do we associate timelessness with black and white? Well, one reason is because it was the first image method that we had, right? Before we had color photography, we only had black and white photography, right? Color photography hasn't really been around for that long. So all of those early images that I showed you were from mostly photographers that shot black and white, although some of them lived long enough to know that color photography existed. Cartier-Bresson was once quoted as saying that he despised color photography. He really just didn't like it. But it can convey a real feeling of timelessness. So this is actually very close to where I live in Baltimore, in a neighborhood called Hamden, which used to be a neighborhood that a lot of the factory and mill workers used to live in before the area became gentrified. And I came across this young girl, and I don't have time to tell you the whole story behind her, but the minute I came across this young girl, I immediately was thinking, first of all, her haunting look, I knew I was going to come out of this with quite a powerful and haunting image. But I was immediately already thinking of how I was going to convert this to black and white, because I wanted to give this image a more timeless quality. She's timeless already. Look at the dress she's wearing. She could have come out of 1935 Appalachia from her haircut and the dress that she's wearing. And I even love some of the stuff that's on her porch behind her, especially those two stone raccoons off to the right. But again, by just doing that conversion to black and white, now I've created an image that, unless you know when that metal cyclone fence was made, you really would have a hard time dating this image. It could come from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. And that's what I mean by that feeling of timelessness. So the only other thing I really did to this image was work on her face, because she had those streaks coming down on her cheeks, which looked like she was crying or was still crying. And I wanted to make sure that I still had those, in the black and white version of the image. And, she just has that look, which just makes you think, what the heck is she, thinking about? And that's the kind of image that I love to create. And again, I don't live very far from Lancaster County, which of course is one of the bigger homes of the Amish people. And they do participate in some public events. So don't worry, I'm not peering over people's fences to pry into their private lives. Some images that I take of Amish people were taken at public events. So I love this portrait of this young Amish boy. I love the eye contact he's making with me. I love the whole image, except I really didn't like the yellow orange straw, hat. Everything else to me is quite timeless about the image. And by just doing a very quick conversion, the hat is still a very important part of the image, but now you're much more drawn to his face and to his eyes, and you're not being pulled away by that yellow orange quality of the hat. And that's why I think black and white is so powerful for portraits, especially the ones that you can consider to be timeless. Because once again, it'd be very hard to guess when this image was taken. He's wearing a very simple coat, because the Amish dress very simply. There's nothing else in this image that gives you any clue really as to when this image was created.
Going back to the last photo, John says that the sign looks like it has one of those old telephone numbers on it.
Yes, it does. It looks like it's only got an exchange and four digits, right? Which means it probably is from, I'm going to say maybe the 50s or the 60s. Yep. And I just loved all the stuff in the background. I like the watering can. I like the rocking chair off to the left. At first, I wasn't too crazy about the cyclone fence, but, that's just where I found her. So that just had to become, part of the image. And I actually have grown to love the fact that she's standing in front of the cyclone fence. And you may not see it when you first look at the image, but she's actually holding something in her left hand. It looks like she's holding the edge of, something, because there's a wooden handle in her left hand, and I don't remember what she was actually holding on to. All right, so I also think black and white is very good for weather, right? Mist, rain, fog, night. I consider nighttime to be a weather phenomenon. It's like a meteorological phenomenon. So I am from New York City, and my wife and I are both big Art Deco fans. We love Art Deco things. And of course, therefore, one of our most famous and one of our best famous buildings to us is the Chrysler Building. And we found ourselves at a couple of years ago on a rooftop bar somewhere off of Fifth Avenue. And I was able to finagle my tripod so that it would reach over the security fence, because it's a rooftop bar. They don't want anyone falling off the roof. And I was able to finagle my way to get my camera and my tripod to be above the security fence. And I was able to use my LCD screen pointed downward so that I could still see and compose an image. And so I composed this image of the Chrysler Building being dwarfed by these two giant towers. The one on the left is complete. The one on the right is still under construction. But when I took a look at the color file, it was way too distracting. The colors are sending out lots of different messages. If you remember that chart about how we associate emotions with certain colors. And I really want the center of interest to be the Chrysler Building. So that was really very simple. Just convert it to a powerful black and white. And then the center of interest becomes the Chrysler Building. And then you start paying attention to the completed tower on the left and the incomplete tower on the right. But first, your eyes are first glued to the Chrysler Building. So again, I think night photography is similar to a weather phenomenon, and I think black and white at night just really shines. It's just a beautiful style of photography to use for nighttime photography. So we also have some wonderful old cemeteries in Baltimore, as most major old cities do. So when you think about cemeteries, there's an inherent contrast right away. Cemeteries almost always have green grass in them. And green is the color of nurture and nature and life. But yet we're looking at a picture of where people are buried after they've passed away. So so that poses an interesting contrast, which I like. But that wasn't what my goal was on the day that I visited this cemetery, which is called Baltimore Cemetery. I really just wanted to convey the message of the grace and beauty of the stones and that beautiful shape of the tree behind it. And so I needed to remove the green. And by just removing the green, I've taken that emotive quality of the green completely out of the image. And now you're left as to look at the cemetery just as stones and that beautiful, graceful tree behind it. And the green is no longer sort of interfering with the message that I was trying to send in the image. And cemeteries are great places to shoot. All right, so I also used to do quite a lot of macro work, and I hadn't done any macro work for a long time. And then COVID hit. And I knew that our rambles were going to be a little closer to home for a while, for sure. We weren't going to be doing much traveling. And I thought, I haven't done any macro work for a long time, and I can always do some macro work in the house by just setting up a little, studio in my dining room, because I have a window with the right exposure. And so I went out to my local, Whole Foods or wherever, and I bought some calla lilies, because I think calla lilies are the most elegant flower. As soon as I started looking through my viewfinder at these calla lilies, I knew that these were going to become black and white images because the color files were not translating the elegance and sophistication that a calla lily can display. So, for instance, this one, after being cleaned up and spotted and converted, became this. And the blackness in the background is actually my TV screen, which is just off. And that just creates this beautiful, deep black background. And so I love the way these started to look in black and white. So I'll just show you a couple of other examples. Here's another one. And at first, I was using things like focus stacking and high apertures to try and get as much of the calla lily in focus as I could. But then I went back to my abstract days and I started to think, well, some of these would make really cool abstract photographs. And so that's what led me to start creating things like this, where I'm using a very shallow aperture and creating a very abstract view of a calla lily. And I think I've got one more. Yeah, here I am just shooting the actual edges of a calla lily, and really the only thing that's pretty sharp are the veins, you know, in the flower, and everything else is left to sort of fall, you know, in a ghostly sort of out of focus way. So again, black and white, wonderful for abstract kind of photography. Now I'm just going to show you a series of some black and whites without you seeing the color file, and then I'm going to take my first pause and we'll see if anyone has any other questions. Remember where I said patience is required as a photographer. So here I am, I'm on the east side of Manhattan. I find this amazing backdrop. I find this pathway. I love the fence on either side of the pathway with the square rectangular shapes. I love the trees coming in from the left. They remind me of sort of like scary Alfred Hitchcock kind of trees. I love the lampposts that are leaning over from the left. And in the background that's an abandoned Con Edison power plant that was abandoned like back in the 1960s, I think. And it sits on a little island that you just can't get to. But what the image lacked was a person. It needed a person to actually complete the image. And if you can see, there's a stairway that comes up from the left-hand side. And even though I was in sort of a slightly remote part of Manhattan, I kind of knew that if I just was patient, I would get someone coming up those stairs, and the person would have to walk toward me because there isn't any way to walk the other way. There's a dead end. And sure enough, after waiting about 10 or 15 minutes, and it was cold, it was a February day, a gentleman came up the stairs, and as soon as he was a little bit behind where you see him now, I just started shooting, and I shot about 12 frames of him. And when I looked at the images later on, this was the one that I thought worked the best in terms of where he is in the frame. And I got lucky because he was also wearing all dark clothing, which I think adds to the mystery of the image. So sometimes you find a great backdrop, but you need something else to happen. And sometimes that something else just needs a little patience. And, you know, that's tough for us sometimes because I think we as photographers get very impatient. So here I am back at the Amtrak station, but this day I went with a goal in mind. And I think having goals in mind when you go out to create some work is always a good idea. I like working on projects as well. On this day, what I had in mind was shadows and silhouettes. That's what I wanted to actually shoot. And I sat myself on a bench across from where you can see there's a door in the background. That's where that beautiful column of light is coming from. And I knew that different people would cross this column of light. And in this particular instance, it was a very elegantly dressed woman wearing a very nice pair of boots, pulling a suitcase, a rolling suitcase. And I just shot and got a great shot of her foot up in the air in that decisive moment with the shadow of her foot in the column of light. And so it's just got everything going for it. It's got that feeling of atmosphere, of mystery, of suspense. Where is she going? What's happening? You can't even see her face, so you don't even know what she looks like. And I think this is, again, where black and white just really, really shines is in this kind of work. Now, you don't necessarily need a human or an animal element, though, to create black and white photography. Remember, I said black and white is good for weather. Well, we don't get as much snow as we used to, but we still get some snow. And after it snows, I try so hard early the next morning to get out and do some photography. The other thing I'll say is that this is an area in Pennsylvania that I used to live in. And so I know where these farms are and these fences are. And remember what I said about having an emotional connection to your subject matter. When you get to know certain places well by visiting them more often and shooting more often, you actually develop a relationship with a physical place. And so I know where these fences are. I know I love this one because of the crossed fences in the middle. And this is just a simple graphic image of fences in the snow with the fallow cornfield, behind it. And here we have a similar image where we have a nice tree line in the distance. And in this case, I was able to back up far enough and get that beautiful curved wooden fence, in the foreground. And again, without the snow, the ground would be pretty ugly. It would be brown and muddy, or just brown. But based on it being covered with even just an inch or two of snow, that makes these kind of images become totally magical. And I never even noticed it, but on the right-hand side, there is one bird up in the, not in the corner, but up on that right-hand corner. You can see there's a small bird flying over one of the trees. So these fences are right next to the ones that I just showed you a couple of images ago. And this was shot this year because we actually did get a little bit of snow this year on about 3 different occasions. And on this particular day, I decided to concentrate more on the part of the farm where these horses hang out. And I loved this image, but there were too many horses that were congregating on the right-hand side. And I waited because I wanted a horse to come in from the left to sort of balance the image. And by just being patient, that horse came in from the left-hand side, stopped for a moment, put his head down to see if he could find some grass to eat underneath the snow. And that's when I made this image. And it's that horse, in terms of the compositional balance of this image, is really important, because without it, the image is definitely too right heavy, with not enough interest on the left. And again, the horses add a feeling of vulnerability and emotion to an image. Okay, so again, a little bit of snow on the ground. I've shot this tree, for about 12 or 13 years. I know exactly where this tree is. I visit this tree about 4 times a year because I try and go and shoot it during every season. This tree has become a friend. This is a friend of mine. I mean, a tree is animate in a way, in that, of course, it's a living thing. It's not animate the way a person or a cat is, but it's animate. And you can actually develop a relationship with things like trees, because if you just get to know them and get to know their form, and I've always loved the rhythm of this particular tree, the way that the branches are splayed, the way that the tree presents itself, especially with this nice stormy sky behind it. It's just a tree that I always, always, always just love to go and shoot. And so that's what creates that emotional connection with things like trees. So it's always good to go back to certain places that you've been to before. Now, black and white is also very good for monochromatic themes. So here's a off-white side of a barn. The only darker elements in this image are the nail holes that you can see and the border around the fence. And in this case, the fence is actually the door, I mean, is actually closed, because you can see that block of wood has the door shut. Now, in this one, which is exactly sort of the opposite, this was a muddy brown colored barn with a white door. And in this case, the latch is open to the door, which I think just changes the quality of the image slightly. I did not like the muddy brown color, though, but I knew that the muddy brown would convert to beautiful shades of charcoal gray, and that's exactly what it did. And so by converting this image to monochrome, I was able to then play with those tonalities on the side of the barn. And you have some, lighter tonalities and some darker tonalities, just offset by the white door and the darker latch. So, this is again where black and white really shines for this kind of photography. This also is a recent shot. I think I took this in November or December. North of Baltimore. It's farm country. This particular snowstorm turned into an ice storm, and all those trees in the background are covered with ice, and that's what makes them look like they have a sheen about them. And all I'm doing in this image is using the corn, the fallow corn, to pull your eye into the farm and to then see the scene beyond. And notice that the buildings have a lot of similar shapes. They have a lot of rectangles, the two vents on the tops of those buildings. And the coup de grace was that's a grain silo on the right, but it had some snow on top of it, and the wind was picking up the snow and blowing it off. And it makes it look like that's a smokestack where it's really just a grain silo. And again, this image didn't have much color in it to begin with, so it certainly lent itself to a black and white. And this also was taken recently. This is only about a half a mile from where I literally used to live in southern York County. And I found myself a good enough perch to be able to shoot down on this landscape and create a multi-layered scene. You have the first layer, which is the field in front of you. Then you have the first row of trees. You have the house off to the right. You then have a second field behind the house. You then have another row of trees in the background, and then you've got a nice stormy looking sky. And so this is just a multi-layered landscape shot, which absolutely lends itself to black and white treatment rather than color treatment. Okay, so before we jump into that, so this is where I will take a pause, and if this is a good time for anyone to ask any questions or comments before we continue on.
Okay, I have a few of them for you. Lewis asks, what software other than Photoshop or Lightroom might he use to convert to black and white?
Okay. Lightroom is the one that I have used pretty much exclusively. I'm not a Photoshop user. I kind of know a little bit about Photoshop, but I don't know much about Photoshop. That's something I need to learn more about. But the other one, which I'm going to demonstrate later, or slightly later, is a program by a company called Nik, N-I-K. The actual company is called DxO. So it's DxO software. They make a program called Nik Silver Effects Pro, which probably is the most powerful black and white conversion program that's out there. And it's a program that I'm still learning a lot more about, because they just put out a new version of it about, I guess, 8 to 9 months ago, I think. And so I'm still learning everything that you can do in Nik. But even if you didn't want to invest money in a different software program, I find that black and white conversions in Lightroom are absolutely fine.
Okay. Mary Lou asks if you use any filters to bring out the storm clouds.
No, I don't use filters anymore. I used to use quite a lot of them in my film days. The only filter I still use on occasion is a polarizer, but I used to use colored filters, warming filters and cooling filters, but because we didn't have any way of affecting the white balance except for filters. But no, now that's all created by me working in the digital darkroom. So no, I'm not really using any filters anymore except for an occasional polarizing filter.
Kathy, in reference to your first crisscross fence, said that fence photo was awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's so simple. I think that's the other magic about photography. That old acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid. The easier you make an image for a viewer to interpret, the more of a reaction you're going to get, right? And when I'm teaching in the field, I'm always teaching, when I look through someone's viewfinder, my most common comment is, you've got way too much in your viewfinder. I don't know what you want me to look at. You need to make it simple for the viewer to look at your image and to know exactly what you want the viewer to look at. That is one of the keys to creating more powerful photography.
Julie asks, what adjustments do you make once converted to black and white?
Boy, we'll get into that a little bit when I do some quick conversions. So I'll show you what other things I do. Not as much as you'd think, probably, but Lightroom has, as well as Nick, has a tremendous amount of control, where you can control a whole bunch of different things. So we'll get into that a little bit more when I actually do some quick conversions from color to black and white.
And Fred asks, do you ask the person for permission? I guess in the photos where you have people walking by.
The answer to that is no, I do not. I am not an asker. Every photographer has to decide what their parameters are in reference to a variety of issues. One issue is trespassing. I get a question quite often, well, do you trespass? And the answer to that is, yeah, at times I do. At times I see a sign that says no trespassing, but there's something beyond that sign that I want to photograph. And I just take the chance of being scooted off or being chased away or whatever. It's the same with people. The minute you ask a person if it's okay to take a picture, you've lost that candid moment. It's just gone, because they're aware then that you're taking an image of them and their expression is going to change. Now, a lot of the images of people that I take are taken with a long lens, so I'm not right in their face, but I'm definitely not letting them know in advance that I'm creating an image of them. And I get that question a lot about Amish. Like people have said to me, well, don't you know the Amish don't like their pictures taken? Well, A, that's not really completely true, because we've chatted with some Amish people about having their pictures taken. And B, as I said, I only take pictures of Amish people at public events where Amish, and they call us the English, where the Amish and the English are mixing. And they're used to photographers being in those crowds taking pictures of them, and they have no problem with it. So, but every photographer, in reference to a whole bevy of these subjects, everybody's got to draw their own line that they feel comfortable with. That's the only way I can answer that question.
John says sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than to ask for permission.
Yes, that is a saying, and I think there is a lot of truth in that saying, especially if you want to get really good candid portraits. That little girl with the flowered dress, that image, if I showed you some images of that girl that I had taken 2 minutes before that image, she was standing on the stoop of her house with her brother, and they saw that I had a camera. So they were mugging for the camera, like making funny faces and stuff like that. And to me, that I took some pictures of them because it was kind of cute. But as I walked away from the house that they lived in, I took one last look behind me, and that's how I caught that haunted look on her face. I would never have gotten that image if I wouldn't have turned around one last time, because that was the look that was on her face when I shot that image. And so, that was just the luck of the draw that I turned around one last time. And because there was something about that little girl that was so haunting, I but I knew that I hadn't captured that yet, so I wasn't going to give up quite yet, and so I turned around one last time and got that image.
Mary Lou asks, what are your favorite lenses?
My favorite lenses are a lens that in 35 millimeter terms, because I don't have a full frame camera. I shoot an Olympus mirrorless, which has got a micro four thirds, so it's got a very small sensor. And I shoot a Nikon D7500, which is an APC sensor. I have lenses for both cameras that equate to 24 wide to 120 long. And I find that those are the most useful lenses. They're also f2.8, so they're pretty fast. And what I always tell people is, rather than upgrading your camera, think about upgrading your glass, because a lot of times the camera body that you have, even though it might be 3, 4, 5 years old, is still a wonderful camera. It may just need a better lens attached to it to give you better results. So it's cheaper to buy lenses than it is to buy a brand new camera body. So, I hadn't bought a new camera until I bought that Nikon last year for probably, my Olympus mirrorless is at least 6 or 7 years old. So, but I do have also telephoto lenses that are more like 250 to 400 when I really want to get much more reach. But generally, a lens that gives you from 24 to 120, that's a good range.
Scott asks, were the fence photographs recorded on film or pixels?
No, those were digital. I haven't shot any film in years. Those were digital files.
Okay. And Lewis comments that the Nick 25th anniversary deal is a great deal. Lots of other software included.
Yeah, they sell it. You have to buy Nick as a package. It's 7 or 8 different filter or programs, whatever you want, whatever term you want to use. Silver FX Pro is one of them, but you also get the VESA, and you get a sharpening program, and you get 7 or 8 different programs, and there's no way to split out just the black and white. The retail price is normally $149.99, but they run sales, and I bought my whole Nick package at 50% off. So I only paid $75 for all 8 of their filters. So I thought that was a pretty good deal.
That is the last one for right now.
All right, then let's move on. All right, so here's the Ansel Adams zone system. We are all, I think, familiar with this, right? Ansel actually developed this system with a guy named Fred Archer, but Fred Archer somehow gets left off all the time, and I feel bad for Fred Archer. This is how they looked at black and white scenes. 0 was pure black, 10 was pure white. Everything lived between 0 and 10. What I liked about this particular zone chart is that it gives you actually the subject matter that appears in these different zones. Now, some people feel that for an effective black and white picture, you need to have 0 to 10. You need to have pure blacks, pure whites, and everything in between. I don't really agree with that. If you go out on a foggy day, you can create some beautiful black and white images, and you might only have zones 3 through 6. You might not have any pure blacks or pure whites. So I think this is a learning chart because you can learn from it, but I don't subscribe to that theory that you have to have that full range of tonality to make a successful black and white image. But it's handy to know that this is the system that Ansel was using, because remember that he was already thinking about the print he was going to make, right? So the print to him was the final piece of the puzzle. Creating the image in the field was the first piece, but the last piece was creating the print. Now, the other reason why I show this is because I want you to quickly keep this in your brain and then look at this chart. This chart is showing you how these different colors, 6 different colors, convert to black and white. And when I first started studying more about color theory and converting to black and white, I was really thrown for a little bit of a loop in terms of how different colors convert to different tonalities. Now, for the sake of black and white photography, the terms tonality, brightness, and luminosity all mean the exact same thing. They're all referring to the amount of light being reflected off of a particular subject matter. Now, as you can see from this chart, the brightest color is actually that violet purple on the end, because the gray tone that's underneath that is actually brighter than the tone under the yellow. So the other reason I show this chart is a lot of people think when they're looking through their viewfinder at what they think is a very colorful image, that it will always convert to a very successful black and white. And that's just not true, because it's going to depend on how the colors that you have in your image convert to black and white using this kind of luminosity scale of brightness. So that's why I think this is a handy one to get to know. And I have a couple of examples. Oh, what happened to I left my house out. Okay. Hang on one quick second. I thought I had a couple of examples of that. No, for some reason, I think for brevity's sake, I took them out. Okay, I used to at this point show some images that look really cool in color, but when you convert them to black and white, they don't really work because the tonalities of the colors were so close together. So I apologize for that. I'll have to track down what happened to those few images. Okay, so here we have another Amish girl portrait. Now, she doesn't look necessarily Amish right from the get-go. In fact, when I've shown this image to different people, people have guessed so many different ethnicities. So the most common answer I get is that most people think this is a Russian emigre, because she sort of has an Eastern European look to her, but she is an Amish young girl. Now, I like this as a color file, but I'm already thinking, well, how can I make it more timeless like I did the other portraits? And what also throws me off with this particular portrait is the pink scarf, because pink to me is a more modern color. Now, that may not be true, because pink may have been around way before I think it was around. But the way my brain interprets pink is a more modern kind of color. And so I want to take the pink out of the image. And so really all I'm going to do in this case, now what I'm going to say first of all about post-processing is post-processing should be a means to an end. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I think you'll all be more successful in your post-processing if you have an idea of what you want to do with your image before you start post-processing it. Because the other way to do it is to take a look at an image that you're not sold on yet. You're not, well, I kind of like it, but there's some things I'm not sure about. But I'll just take it into Photoshop or Lightroom and I'll just play with all the sliders and the tone curve, and I'll see if I can get something good out of it. I can only tell you, for me, that only works about 5% of the time. And 95% of the time, I'm wasting my time, because unless I'm sold on an image right from the get-go, I'm not going to be able to turn it into a masterpiece if it doesn't have the good bones that an image requires. And when I say good bones, I mean a good composition, good tonality, the right exposure. There's so much you can correct for in post-processing, but you can't make a bad image a good image. I just don't, subscribe to that theory. The second thing I'll say, as we start to do some of these conversions, when I'm doing a black and white conversion seriously, and that would be for a print that I'm actually have sold, to someone that's buying it, or potentially for a competition at our camera club, or if I'm entering it into someone else's competition, I go back to the same image probably anywhere between 3 and 5 times before I consider myself done. And each time I spend about 10 or 15 minutes. So what I'm getting at is, for me to do a complete black and white conversion is over an hour per image, split into different segments. So we don't have enough time to do that. So what I'm going to show you tonight are really more some just kind of down and dirty methods that I kind of use, right? Because we just don't have the time to do that. So in this image, as I said, I didn't like the pink. And so in Lightroom, the easiest and the only way to convert to black and white is really just to click on black and white. You can desaturate an image, but that's not quite the same. So the easiest thing to do is just to click on black and white. And when you are in Lightroom and you click on black and white, you still have control over the 8 color channels. Red, orange, you have the ability to control these colors even within a black and white file. So that was a pink scarf. Now, pink is going to be closer to magenta than any other colors. And so if I take my magenta slider, I can either make that scarf darker or I can make that scarf lighter. And in my case, I was really wanting to make it almost white. And so I took the magenta slider and just made the scarf be more of a pure white. And in this case, the other thing that I did is there were some details in her face. Her face is in a lot of shadow. And so Lightroom has a tool called the radial filter, one of the fine adjustments, which is this filter right here. I clicked on my radial filter. You always double click then on the word effect, which will zero out any changes that were still left from the last time you were doing it. I always have invert checked because I want the changes that I'm going to be made to be within the circle, not outside the circle. And then you can create your radial filter of the size that you want, and you can drag it down exactly where you want it. And all I then did was increase the shadows. I wanted to bring those shadows up on her eyes, bring the highlights up a little bit. I just wanted her face to be a little brighter than it was. And so down and dirty, that's about, for tonight's lesson, so to speak, we went from there to there. Now, I would then go back and do some work maybe with her hair and things. But again, just to show you, quickly how easily it is to turn that color file into, I think, a file that now is more timeless in quality because of the removal of that pink color. All right. We are blessed with all these beautiful sunflower fields. The other wonderful thing about black and white is if you have seen a scene of some subject matter a gazillion times and want to create something unique, you should potentially think of black and white. Now, these are sunflower fields that are north and west of Baltimore. When they're in bloom, we as photographers love to go shoot at these places. Why not? They're beautiful. They're gorgeous. They're happy. They're wonderful places. And remember that whole thing about colors and emotion. This is such a positive, joyful, emotional color image. But I've seen it a million times, right? So one day I thought, well, I wonder what it would look like in black and white because I have really nice colors to play with. So I just converted it to black and white. And I went down to those color channels. And the first thing I did was make the sky deeper because I can control the blue channel. And then I wanted to make the flower more glowy. I wanted it actually to glow. So I just brought my yellows and my oranges up. Right? And I could also do anything I wanted to the green foliage. I could make the green foliage darker or I could make it brighter. And that's really just an aesthetic choice. I happen to like it slightly lighter for tonight's presentation. And the only other thing I did was I wasn't crazy about the shadow that's within the center of this sunflower. You could put a radial filter over it, like I just did the girl's face. Or the other thing you could do is open up this thing called the adjustment brush. And again, you always should double click the word effect to zero out whatever was in there before. And I'm just going to bring my shadow slider up, and I'm going to bring my highlights up a little bit, and I'm going to bring my whites up a little bit. And then I'm just going to use it as a paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint. Now, you should bet it's better off doing this with a stylus, like a Wacom tablet, but right now I'm just doing it with my mouse. And so again, just by doing some quick down and dirty enhancements, we took an image like this that we've all seen a million times, and we turned it into this. And I had never seen a really nice black and white sunflower image. And I really, I just always loved this one, as well as the color one. And whether it sends out a different kind of emotional message, I don't really think it does. I still think it's a very happy, joyful image, but it's just representing it in a slightly different way. Now, the other fun thing I've been having a lot of fun lately with is I used to shoot slides, as I said to you guys before. Now, originally I shot Kodachrome slides, but then I realized as I looked through my National Geographics that photographers were shooting mostly this film called Fuji Velvia. And I said, oh, I don't even know Fujifilm. And so I bought a few rolls of Fuji Velvia. And once I shot Fuji Velvia, I never shot another slide film again, because it is the most saturated, colorful, vibrant slide film that you could use. And so what I've done lately is I've scanned some of my slides, because one of my friends got my scanner to work. I wasn't able to get it to work on Windows 10, but he figured out a way to do it. And so I've been scanning some of my Velvia slides and turning them into digital files, and then doing some black and white conversions. So for instance, here's a Cataract Falls, a small waterfall. I don't remember where I took this, but as a color file, I like the way the falls look, but I don't know whether you guys see it, but the whole image has sort of a magenta tonality about it. There's just something unattractive about it. And I thought I could turn it into a pretty contrasty black and white file. So again, I'm going to just click black and white. But in this case, I'm going to open up where you see those 4 rectangles next to each other. If you click on those, you bring up all the Adobe presets. And if you only want to look at the black and white presets, you can just click black and white, and that will then eliminate the color ones. Now, remember I said that you should have an idea of what you want to do with your image before you start working on it. Well, what I want to do with this image is highlight the falls. I want you to be able to see the background on either side of it, but I don't want it quite as visible as it is. And so all you need to do if you're in Lightroom is you can just mouse over. You don't even have to click on these presets. You can just mouse over each one and see what effect it gives you. It's like this one dulls the falls down a little bit. This one brightens up the falls a little bit. So I'm looking for one where the fall stays bright, but the background gets a little darker. See that the falls is way too dark there. And so for instance, for tonight, I'll just say I'm going to pick black and white preset 9. And so I just click on 9, and then I can close the presets down, right? And then all I'm going to do is again, go to my adjustment brush, double click effect to zero out whatever was in there before. And what I want to do is take the exposure down of the areas that I want to paint. And I want to take the highlights down. I want basically to make the background on either side of the falls much darker. And I just then start painting over the areas that I want to be darker. I still want you to see the detail, but I don't want you to see quite as much. And you can see as I paint over these areas that they're just darkening down. But you can still make out, what's behind them. And so by just doing that, I've quickly converted that color slide that had sort of a funny magenta cast into, a pretty striking looking picture of a small waterfall, with foliage on either side. So it's really, a lot of this is pretty simple, but it's always simpler if you've got a game plan. All right, so this again was a color slide that I took in Colorado. That's a big snowstorm coming in. That's what that stormy sky is. And those are some beautiful aspen, trees. What I also suggest people do when they start to post-process an image, before you convert to black and white, you should do general fixes. Like, for instance, let's say in this image, I wanted to crop some of the bottom off. Well, I would just first do that. I would crop the image. Let's say I want to take the bottom to where those roots are and just stop there. And let's say, for instance, I wanted to bring that in a little bit from the left. So I would make those kind of changes first before actually thinking about the conversion process. So I suggest cropping things first. Now, in this image, my roadmap, again, is pretty simple. I love the dark sky, so I want to definitely emphasize that dark sky. And I really love the way the aspens are standing out, but maybe I can make them stand out even a little more. And I love the way that I intersperse these evergreens in between these aspen trees. But notice that this one over here on the left, he's pretty dark and you can't see much detail in him because he's pretty dark. So that sort of gives me an idea of what I want to do with the image. So I'm going to convert to black and white. I'm going to open up those presets. And I'm once again going to try and find one that brings me closer to my goal. And you don't have to do this. You can just start from pure monochrome and just do this, with all the different sliders. But I find if you can find a preset like this one, I like the way that looks, that gets you half of the way there. Why not? This one happens to be an orange filter, meaning that this is representing what it would look like if there was an orange filter. So I'll pick that one for tonight, and then I can just close it down. And remember, I still have those controls over the color channels, so I can still make that sky even stormier looking. But I don't want to get rid of that sliver of sun that's coming in from the bottom right in here. I really like that sliver of sunlight, but I made the clouds even a little stormier. Click on my brush to close it again. Now I'm going to click on it again and double click effect to zero it out. And this time I want to open up the shadows of that one evergreen. So I'm going to take my shadow slider and move it to the right and then paint over this evergreen just so you can see more of the detail. Now you can kind of see more of the specific branches, and if you really wanted to, you could very carefully do that on each one of these if you wanted to. And the last thing I want to do, I'm going to close my brush down again, is even though these three aspens in the front, they're really standing out, I even want them to stand out a little more from the background. So once again, I'm going to take my adjustment brush, I'm going to double click effect to zero it out. I'm going to take my exposure up a little bit, and I'm basically just going to paint extra exposure onto these aspens. And again, better done with a tablet and a Wacom tablet, because you can see I'm going off the edge a little bit. but the masking in Lightroom has actually gotten much better. So you don't have to be quite as careful as you needed to be a few years ago. There we go. Now I'm happy with the way those 3 aspens look. Now they're really popping. And this, I've printed this, and it really comes out to be a stunning black and white print because it's very contrasty. You can tell from the nice spread in the histogram. So again, down and dirty, I'd probably go back to this image. I probably went back to this image at least 4 or 5 times and, continue to tweak it. But in a nutshell, that's what I did. Now, remember, those leaves had a lot of green and yellow and orange in them. And so I can go again to my color channels and I can make those leaves even a little brighter by just introducing a little more emphasis on the yellow and the green. And so now I'm looking at an image that really is catching my eye. I love it as a color file, but I also really enjoy it as a black and white file. Oh, this is what happens every once in a while. Back to this. I apologize for this. I'll be right back. Go back to this and then move on forward. There we go. All right, so I don't remember if this was a color slide or a digital file, but I know where I was. This was taken somewhere in Utah, and this is that age-old what to do with your plain blue sky problem. Now, I know some of you that are listening to me and some of my friends have really gotten into how wonderful AI has gotten, right? Artificial intelligence. So you could swap this sky out for another sky, right? Of your own making, or you could pick a sky from someone else's picture. But I want to also show you that once you have a handle on what you can do in different software programs, you may not necessarily need to do that. I remember this as being a very dramatic scene, but boy, it doesn't look very dramatic now. It looks kind of drab. The gray is not really very cool looking, and the plain blue sky is not really doing me any favors. So, there's a lot of things about this that I want to improve. So the first thing I'm going to do is take it into the develop module, which is where I can make changes. And the first thing that I really didn't like about this image was this either rock or log that seems to be sticking out right there. Now, this is much better done in Photoshop than in Lightroom, but I want to just show you that you can do those kind of things in Lightroom. This is your spot removal or cloning tool. So you could make a circle big enough to handle that item, and it's going to sample from content aware. It's going to try and sample from an area that's close in tonality to what it was before you removed it. If you don't like where it's sampled from, you can move this circle to a place where you do like it. And I just usually do this to a place where I think it looks natural, where it doesn't look so obvious that I took something out, of the picture. So let's just say for tonight's purposes, I'm going to just stop there. So I got that. Yep, that to me looks perfectly natural, but I got rid of that. To me, that was sort of like an unsightly log or stone that was getting in the way. Okay, so I'm going to convert this to black and white, and I'm going to once again open up my presets. And what's my roadmap? Well, in this case, my roadmap is I know that with a plain featureless blue sky, you could turn that into a very dramatic, very dark sky. So one goal is to make the sky really as dark as I can, and then to work on the rest of the things that need to be worked on. So basically, I just start the same process. I go through the presets, and I'm looking for one. That's pretty good. That sky got pretty dark right there. Oh, that's even better. All right, I'm going to pick black and white 6. So I pick black and white 6, and then I can click close. Now, since I still have control over the color channels, remember that sky was plain blue. Watch what happens. I can make it jet black. And notice how good Lightroom has gotten. There's no haloing. You can't really see any artifacts. A few years ago, this would be a difficult adjustment to make because you would see sort of an edge around that. But right now, it's gotten good enough where that's not the case. Now, this image still needs a lot of work. This whole area in here is too dark. I want to add some texture to it, down here. And you can use a variety of tools to do a variety of things. In this case, I'm going to open up my adjustment brush again. I'm going to double click effect. I'm going to bring up my shadows. I'm going to bring up my exposure. And I'm going to basically paint to try and lighten up this area a bit, which is too much in the shadow. Yeah, that's looking better. Let's see, and there's always an erase tool, by the way. If you ever make a mistake, you could always then open up another brush and click erase, and then take off what you just put, because I thought that was a little too bright. And I still need to work on this. This still needs to be. Let me go back to my A brush. This still needs to be worked on because that still needs to be brighter. There we go. All right, then I'm going to close my brush down. And then to work on the bottom half of the picture, I'm going to open up the graduated filter, which works the way a graduated neutral density filter works. And I'm going to place it about right where I want the effect to start, which is right there. And I'm going to just drag it down. Oops, I see I didn't double click effect. Okay. And I'm going to bring my toolbar up quickly because I want to see where the mask is. And by clicking show mask, it'll show you. So right now the filter is actually upside down because whatever effect I now apply is going to be where the red is. That's not what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this filter and I'm actually going to just turn it around. And then I'm also going to bring this line much closer. I'm going to have to start again. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Now we're getting it. Okay. So now the effect is only going to be applied in a graduated way from the bottom to the top line. And now I can take my mask off. And now I'm going to add some texture, which is what I said, one of the things I wanted to add. And I'm going to add some clarity, which is basically mid-tone contrast. And I really love these lines. So I really want those lines to be highlighted. Bring some highlights, bring the shadows up a little bit. Right about there. And I'll just stop at this moment. And so we took a really blah image and turned it into something very dramatic looking. Now, this might not be to everybody's taste, but it really, to me, it conjures up the feeling of awe that I felt when I was touring this part of Utah. Whereas that first color image that I showed you of the same scene just looks washed out, just doesn't look right. So to me, that's why creating these wonderful black and whites is so much fun, because they just really can change the way you feel about an image. So we're getting toward the end of the program now. Let's see how we doing on time, guys.
We're doing pretty good.
Okay. All right. Remember I said that emotion is very important to me as far as photography. So in 2019, I actually went through a bit of a serious illness, and knock on wood, I'm fine now. If you ever get seriously ill, Baltimore is a great city because we have Hopkins and University of Maryland and all these great places. And, but I did go through a period of illness and then recuperation. And I found out that during that period of time, I was attracted to different subject matters that I would not normally be attracted to. And I think it was because of my emotional state. I was in a different emotional state at this time. And I came across this field of dying sunflowers, and I normally would just pass by something like this and say, wow, that's really not attractive. I like them when they're, in full bloom. But there was something about some of these fading sunflowers that really attracted me. And so in this case, I'm going to use Nik instead of Lightroom. Okay. So I'm going to go into the image. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to edit in. And you'll see that one of the programs that I can edit in is SilverFX Pro. And I do want to edit it with Lightroom adjustments. And this will now turn into the Nik SilverFX Pro screen. Hopefully. That's odd. Well, maybe we won't be displaying a Nik tonight. That's never happened to me before. Edit in SilverFX Pro. Yes.
If you look on the bottom, it looks like it's flashing.
Ah, there we go. Now you should be seeing a different screen, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I don't have nearly enough time to do a demonstration of Nik. I probably will be doing a webinar soon on Nik SilverFX Pro. All I'll point out is in Nik SilverFX Pro, you have 58 presets to pick from, whereas in Adobe, you've only got about 11 or 12. So that's number one. Number two is that everything on the right are controls that you can apply to your black and white images. So brightness, instead of it just being brightness, is subdivided into highlights, midtones, and shadows. So you can actually pick that you want the shadows to have a little more brightness, so this is much more specific than Lightroom is, which is why I need to study it more and why it will become my go-to program. But for tonight, what I'm going to first just say is that my roadmap for this image was simple. I wanted the eye to look right at the yellow fading flowers. And again, I wanted the background to fade into kind of obscurity. So right away, you can't mouse over these. You need to actually click on them. Right away, I see two that I like. This high contrast 003 or high contrast 004. And I think I like 003 just a little better. Why isn't it? Yeah, it's a little brighter. So that's accomplished a lot of my goal because the background has now receded and these are now nice and bright. One of the other things that's really wonderful in Nik, the only other thing I'll show you about Nik is the way all of their filters work are by what are called control points. So by just clicking on control point, I can then bring it into the image and click anywhere and you get a bunch of sliders. And the first slider is how big you want the control point to be. Right? It only can be circular though. It cannot be any other shape. So I'm going to just make it circular because I just want to darken part of this image down a little bit. So amplify blacks. So you can see what that's doing. It's taking the white out of it. So this is how Nik programs work. You put a variety of control points and you can put as many control points as you want in an image and do a specific correction to any part of the image. But again, for tonight, for time's sake, we're not going to do that. And so now I'm just going to click. Wow. How come I'm not seeing save at the bottom? Notice, by the way, that Nick also gives you, here's the zone system, 0 to 10. And by mousing over it, you can see what things fall into which zones. But I should be seeing at the very bottom here the save button, which I'm not seeing.
I think if you minimize the screen, you'll see it. So that,
Maybe. Oh, I kind of lost Nick altogether. Save all. Well, let's just try. Let's see. Oh, I see what that means. No, I don't want that. I got to just take this off. Now I'm just going to click save all. Hopefully this will do what I think it'll do. Because what it should do now is just import it right back into Lightroom. Because the interface between Nick SilverFX Pro and Lightroom is really now a piece of cake in terms of just going back and forth. Yep, there it goes. So now I have it back in Lightroom, and I can continue to work on this in any way that I want to, using all the Lightroom tools. So again, this part, the top is still a little too bright for me. So I'll open up my adjustment brush and I'll bring exposure down. And I can just paint over the areas that I think are a little too bright. Like that. I can actually even, I don't like that hole in the leaf. I can again do that cloning trick. I can just take my cloning tool and put it over that hole and just let it sample from another part of the leaf. And it's not going to look like it was ever even there. Like that. And then I probably would spend some time just continuing to darken down some of this stuff in the background, including this little stem back here. So you can see that it was pretty easy to do that. And what I now have is just a couple of other samples of work that I did around the same time. This is a zinnia that was decaying in a garden near my house. Here we have a fern, but notice I darkened down the background. Here we have some cornflowers, and I painstakingly darkened down each one of these leaves so that these two white cornflowers would really pop off the screen. Okay, and so it took a friend of mine to say to me, your images lately, Lewis, are very dark. I wonder if the illness that you've been going through and living with is having an influence on your photography. And that's what really keyed me to thinking about, yeah, Arthur, you're right. That's exactly right. Let me ask a question now. How many do you think, Christine, how many people do have their own printers and do printing?
a lot of them do, or they know how to for whenever we have our print contests.
Okay. All right.
But they can send them out and get printed if they don't have their own.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to, because sometimes when people are just not, sometimes some clubs have very few people that do any printing, and I just leave the print part of the program out, but we'll include it. But before we get to that, I'll just point out one last thing, and then I'll do a quick overview of printing. HDR photography, high dynamic range photography. That's the process of shooting the same scene at different exposure values, right? And then merging the different images into one. And when you think about black and white photography, you should keep high dynamic range photography in mind. For instance, here's a shot. This image on the left is the exposure that my camera thought was correct. This is one stop underexposed. This is one stop overexposed. And then I merged the three and it became this. Now, as a color file, that's a little over the top for me. You know, it looks too overproduced. But watch what happens to it if you convert it to a black and white. It really becomes quite stunning. And all of a sudden, to me, it loses that over-the-top quality that the color file has. To me, that's too over-processed. But I love what it did to the black and white. Because remember, high dynamic range photography, you're basically increasing the range of your sensor. You're basically allowing it to capture the best of the brights and the best of the darks, and then just creating a new file. So it sometimes is a very effective way to create some really incredible black and white images. So so keep bracketing in mind. Okay, now we'll just do a quick review of the print module. So I'm going to pick this image of the Gunpowder River, and I'm going to do a couple of quick modifications. I don't like that snag. That's a piece of wood in the river. I'm going to just take that out with my cloning tool, just by removing it completely from the image. I love the silvery tone I was getting on the water, and that's why I thought that this would also look good as a black and white. So I took it into black and white. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the presets or stuff like that, tonight, because we're running. I don't want to go too long, but I'll bring up the whites. And what I also want to do, just one little thing I want to do, I want to take my adjustment brush and I want to bring out some details underneath this rock, which is all in deep shadow. And just by taking my shadow slider and bringing it up, I can bring those shadows up. Now I like the way it's looking. Now, notice that I'm still in the develop module. I'm going to turn my brush off. Notice that in Lightroom, you have a little checkbox down here called soft proofing. I would strongly recommend to anyone that has Lightroom and does their own printing to get used to how this can help you. If you turn soft proofing on, the first thing it's going to do is change your background color, which right now is black, to white, because this is what your piece of paper looks like that you're going to be printing it on. Now, notice what your brain does in the way it's perceiving this image. Dark background, light background. It really does change your perception of how the image looks on a white piece of paper versus against a black background. And what soft proofing gives you the ability to do is to basically create a virtual copy of your original file. That's what this is, a proof preview. And you can make changes to this file before sending it to the print module, but you won't be changing the original raw file. You're only changing a virtual copy that you're going to send to the printer. So notice if I do any change, a dialog box comes up and it's saying, oh, do you want to create a virtual copy? Yes, give me a proof copy. And now I've created a proof copy. And any change that I make to this image is only now being made to this image and not to my master raw file. Notice that what also happened was these other drop downs came up. Profile should be set to the paper that you're printing on and the brand and model of your printer. So I'm using an Epson 2880 and I'm using GFS paper, gold fiber silk paper, right? That's important because your software and your monitor and your printer all need to be on the same page for you to get an accurate print, especially for black and white. Notice that there's another little checkbox called simulate paper and ink. You absolutely want to check that because you do want it to simulate as close as possible to the paper and ink that you're using. These terms, perceptual and relative, they have more to do with color photography than black and white photography. But notice what happens to the histogram. Right now, perceptual is the one highlighted, but look at the histogram if I click on relative. It changes. And so even for a black and white file, I usually sort of go back and forth a couple of times and try and see what's actually changing and just leave it on the one that I like the most. So in this case, it would be the perceptual. I just happen to think that looked a little better. Now, at this point, you're ready. So at this point, you can just then go right to the print module, right? And it's very, very simple. You just click on page setup. That is set to the printer. My stylus R2880. It's a portrait. If it was a landscape, you'd have to change it to landscape. There's my paper size. It's not being fed by a roll. It's being fed by an individual sheet of paper. So all that's set to exactly what you need it to be set by. You have some paper choices you can make. The gold fiber silk actually is considered ultra premium luster paper, so I have it set to that. This is where you choose color or black and white. I definitely want to choose the Epson Advanced Black and White driver. Here you can actually check on the quality, which I always want to be the best quality. So I move that all the way to the top. And I usually take high speed off, although they claim that high speed doesn't really degrade the quality at all. So now I've got all these things set to exactly where I want them. And really your last thing that you would check right now would be the size, the cell size. Is what size do you want the print to be? Now, I have it set to 16 high by 11 wide, right? But what is the actual dimension that I'm getting? The actual dimension I'm getting is not what I'm setting. It's actually 11 by 14.667. Why is that? The reason that is because of what we call aspect ratio. Remember that every one of your cameras have a natural aspect ratio. Nikon is 3:2. Olympus is 4/3, 4:3. If you crop an image, you're taking pixels away. And so you might be changing your aspect ratio a little bit. Now, there is a little quick fix in Lightroom, this little button right here called Zoom to Fill. If I click that button, it will turn the print to exactly what size I want, but notice what happened. It actually cropped some of the content out. And I don't like it cropped out. I like it looking like this. So the bottom line is, in a perfect world, we would all have our own mat cutters, and every time we printed a print, we wouldn't bother about exactly what size the print needed to be to fit into a pre-cut mat. We would just cut a mat to fit the image. But because that does take time, money, energy, etc., we don't always tend to do that. But that's why sometimes your cell size won't match what you're trying to get it to be, because the aspect ratio is just a little different from what you're trying to get at. Okay. And that is the conclusion of tonight's program. There's my web address if you want to take a look at some other of my work. There's my email address if you'd like to keep in touch. I do teach courses that are sometimes listed on my website. I do individual classes via Zoom. So if anyone is interested in pursuing anything else with me further, I am definitely open to doing that. And I just want to thank you again for your time. And this would be the time to ask any other final questions.
Kathy says, what a great program. I have learned several Lightroom tips tonight.
That's great.
And Julie said, yes, me too.
That's wonderful. I love to hear that.
Susan says, I like the explanation that clarity is mid-tone contrast.
Clarity is mid-tone contrast. That's exactly correct. Yep.
Lewis says, super presentation, got lots of new ideas.
Excellent.
Scott says, well thought out, well presented, thanks.
Great.
Lewis, if you could hit that stop sharing button on the bottom, we'll get your face back up on here.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate the compliments. You're going to get a Survey Monkey survey from Christine tomorrow morning, I think she said. So please, I would love it if you would just take a quick minute or two out of your day to just fill out the survey, and it'll get to me anonymously. I don't know who's filled them out, but I've had every camera club, do it for me since I started giving these presentations, and I really find the feedback amazingly helpful. So I'd appreciate that. And you're also going to get a recap of the program.
Mary Lou says this was very inspirational. Excellent. Susan says very interesting. Thanks.
Great.
Mary Lou says I learned so much, and Julie says lots of great information.
Super.
Lewis, can you tell us about your upcoming courses and classes?
Well, I'm actually in the process of just finishing some. So I have a course that I teach on black and white photography. So if you enjoyed this presentation, I have a course that basically takes 4 like hour and a half Zoom course lessons where we go into the details of everything that I touched on in much more detail. So that's one of the courses that I teach. I also teach a Lightroom course from time to time, depending on the interest that I'm getting. And I've also been doing a lot of individual one-on-one Zoom tutoring, which is, Zoom has opened up a whole world for us photographers and for us teachers because, you don't need to be physically, in the same place anymore to be able to teach, any skill that people want to learn about photography. So keep in touch with my website, basically, which is so simple. It's just Lewis Katz Photography. And I have a tab that's labeled, I think, instruction. And if you just keep in touch with that, you'll see whenever I put a new course out, that's where it will be listed.
Can people buy your amazing prints?
Yes, people can definitely buy my prints. You could send me an email to my olympus21209@yahoo.com address and tell me what print what image you liked of the ones that I saw or anything that's on my website, and give me an idea of what size you're interested in, and I'll be very happy to quote you a price.
Julie says, thank you, Lewis. Leslie
Sure.
says, wonderful presentation. And JC says, great program. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for your attention and your time, and I hope our photographic paths cross again in the future.
As Lewis says, tomorrow morning you will be receiving the survey from him that is all anonymous and a summary of his course tonight. A big thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll join us next week for our photo contest on One Light Portraits. Remember to keep an eye out from our contest chair on the photo file sizing and naming requirements, as well as the deadline. Lewis, please stick around for a bit while we go to our end title screen. Good night, everyone.